Section 6 of The Book of Whales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. The Book of Whales by Frank Evers Beddard. Chapter 2. Some Internal Structures. Part 2. The Shoulder Girdle. The shoulder girdle of the whales consists of an apparently single bone, which has a highly characteristic form, liable to some range of variation. The major part of this bone is formed of the scapula, while a process directed forward is the coracoid, more pronounced in the larger number of whales than in any other among the higher mammalia. The scapula is broad and flattened, but both the breadth and the degree of flattening is not by any means uniform. In the sperm whale, the bone is gently concave. It is very much broader, i.e. longer in an antero-posterior direction in the rorquals than in the right whales. Near to the anterior edge of the blade bone is a ridge, which ends in a particularly long process, the acromion. Only in the Megaptera is this process, and also the coracoid process underlying it, markedly reduced. In Platanista, there is another abnormality of structure. The acromion coincides absolutely with the anterior margin of the blade bone, so that the ridge of the spine of the scapula is quite absent as a distinct structure. It is worthy of note that in Megaptera, which has the longest flippers of all whales, the acromion and the coracoid process should be reduced to a minimum or even practically absent. Organs of respiration. Not only is the influence of a purely aquatic life to be seen in the outward form of whales, the respiratory organs and parts annexed show the same modification. Bearing in mind the peculiar habits of whales, their capacity for remaining a long time under water, and the necessity therefore of supplying themselves with a good stock of air for use during those prolonged immersions, we should indeed expect to find that in the vascular, as well as in the respiratory organs, there were differences to be seen not found in mammals, which are purely terrestrial. And this is precisely what we do find. But here again, it is not always easy to distinguish between adaptational likeness and the real affinity. It is, that is to say, not always clear that structures supposed to be modified owing to the habits of the creature are not marks of likeness to some other family of mammals. But we shall consider these points as they arise. Dr. Otto Müller, who has recently and elaborately dealt with this matter, has particularly dwelt upon the form of the chest cavity in these aquatic mammals. Among terrestrial creatures, the shape of this cavity is, as a rule, boat-like in transverse section. The cavity narrows below and is wider above. Furthermore, its ventral boundary line is about as long as its dorsal, the result of this being that the diaphragm, the partly tendinous but chiefly fleshy septum which separates the chest cavity from that in which are lodged the liver, intestines, and stomach, has a vertical direction, and stands, as it were, upright in the body. In the whales, on the other hand, the chest cavity is more barrel-shaped, oval in section, sometimes, indeed, transversely oval. Its dorsal boundary is much longer than its ventral, and in consequence the diaphragm is distinctly and mostly very oblique in direction. It is, however, one thing to state these differences, and quite another to assert that they are modifications connected with the aquatic habit. It might be suggested, in the first place, that these marks of distinction are merely characteristic of whales, just as it is characteristic of one division of whales to have a free malar bone, a fact which is simply of classificatory significance and has no bearing, at least so far as we can see, upon any special difference in the mode of life of its possessor. Furthermore, the obliquity of the diaphragm might be associated with the shortening of the sternum, which is so marked a character of the whales, especially of the whalebone whales. A whole series of facts, however, upset these at first sight reasonable objections, and seem to prove the contrary, i.e., that the modifications in question are really connected with the aquatic life and with nothing else. In the otter, and still more in the seal, which are examples of two stages in the literally downward progress of a land animal toward an aquatic existence, these several characters are seen in a condition intermediate to that which obtains in the purely land animal on the one hand, and in the purely aquatic whales on the other. And furthermore, in the manatee, which, if it be an ally of the whale, can hardly be regarded as an ally of the carnivora, to which group of course the otter and the seal belong, there is the same obliquity of the diaphragm. Thus, in three types, the whale, the manatee, and the seal, we have the same series of modifications existing. If the whale is a relative of the manatee, it is not of the seal, so that any renewed attempt to urge the argument from affinity fails. As to the obliquity of the diaphragm being due to the reduction of the sternum, this is disproved by several instances among the whales. In Beluga, the diaphragm is attached to the sternum before its end. In Hyperoodon, the same is the case, while in Balænoptera, the attachment is altogether behind the sternum. There is thus no special relation to be observed between the end of the sternum and the ventral insertion of the diaphragm. Moreover, as showing that it is a modification of a recent kind, it is interesting to notice that in the porpoise of the youngest stage that has been observed, the relative proportions of the ventral and the dorsal line of the thoracic cavity are as 1 to 1.75, while in the adult the same proportions are as 1 to 2.25. Thus these peculiarities are developed quite late, showing that they are a recent acquisition, and tending therefore to prove that they are developed in consequence of altered habitat. The lungs themselves are characterized by their simple form. In the Mammalia generally the lungs are more complex. They are divided into a number of separate lobes, the practical result of which is to increase the lung surface without any corresponding need for an enlarged chest cavity to contain them in. The same result is brought about in the whale by the increased length of the lungs themselves. As already mentioned, the chest cavity is proportionately larger than in terrestrial mammals. Therefore it follows that the lungs can be bigger without any lobulation. As a matter of fact, they are. What is uncertain at present is whether this simplicity is a primitive feature in the organization of these animals, or whether it is a reduction following upon the alteration of other conditions. It is exceedingly difficult to decide such matters. But before we attempt to decide, another important feature of the structure of these aquatic mammals must be mentioned. In many parts of the body of whales, the blood vessels form to a very copious degree the anastomosing networks which are known technically as retia mirabilia. A rete mirabile is produced by the breaking up of an artery into a meshwork of minuter arterioles. The net physiological result, so far as concerns the mechanical effects of such a breaking up, is the slowing of the blood stream at such spots and the increase of the surface of blood exposed to the surrounding organs and tissues. It seems to follow from this that the oxygen contained in the blood would be more fully utilized by the tissues through which the retia pass than in the case of a single tube. In fact, in the whale we have a state of affairs which in some degree suggests the respiratory conditions occurring in an insect, where the ramifying tracheae bring the air to the organs individually, instead of, as in the bulk of air-breathing animals, the air having to be extracted from the blood by the tissues. These large reservoirs of oxygen within the body, and in close relation to various organs which need abundant oxygen, then do away with the need for an increased lung surface in these diving animals. But not altogether. It looks as if the simpler condition of the lung had been retained, for in reptiles the lungs have the same simple unlobulated structure, the increase being simply brought about by an increased length rendered possible by the greater obliquity of the diaphragm. The whale's stomach. It is a highly characteristic feature of whales, and one which is absolutely universal, that they have an exceedingly complicated stomach. In man the stomach is simply a bent, somewhat U-shaped, wide region of the gut. There is, however, a difference observable in the structure of the lining membrane between what is called the cardiac portion of the organ, so called because it lies nearest the heart, and the distal pyloric region, out of which opens the intestine. As a rare abnormality, however, the stomach of man is divided by constrictions into 3 chambers. Among rodents it is common for the stomach to be divided into 2 or more less sharply marked off chambers by a median constriction. This chambering of the stomach is, however, carried out to a large extent only in the Sirenia, manatee, the sloth, the ruminants, oxen, antelopes, deer, camels, and in the whales. It must not be at once concluded from this circumstance that the whales are related intimately to one or other or to all of these groups. We shall see presently that the divided stomach of the whales is essentially different from the divided stomach of the other animals. They simply have in common the bare fact that it is divided. But before proceeding to generalities, it will be convenient to lay before the reader some of the facts. We cannot give here a detailed account of the stomach in the entire order. Dr. Jungklaus, the most recent writer upon the subject, quotes no less than 63 memoirs apart from his own, which deal entirely, or more or less incidentally, with the cetacean stomach. To this memoir of Dr. Jungklaus's we must refer for additional details, and for this list of literature. The common porpoise may conveniently serve as a starting point. Its stomach is among the least complicated, and it is clearly the most accessible of whales for study. In that creature, the stomach has the form which is indicated in a diagrammatic form in the accompanying sketch. The esophagus opens into a wide blind sac, near to the upper esophageal side of which opens out of this the second division of the stomach. At the lower end of this latter, and in the thickness of its wall, is a small passage, regarded as the third division, which leads into a long and rather narrow division of the stomach. This is the fourth chamber. It is curved in an undulating fashion, and from it arises the commencement of the small intestine, which commencement is dilated, and might be regarded by some as a fifth stomachial chamber, were it not for the fact that into it opens the combined duct of the liver and of the pancreas. Beluga and the narwhal have stomachs which agree in many points with each other, and differ slightly from the porpoise. Those whales, as will be seen later, form a well-defined group of dolphins, contrasting in other points with the remaining Delphinidae. In both of them, the first division of the stomach is strongly divided into two separate chambers. The minute third chamber of the porpoise stomach, simply in that animal an excavation in the thick wall of compartment 2, is here larger, and a distinct chamber visible before the stomach is dissected. Finally, there is a fifth chamber, separated off from the fourth, and like it of an elongated intestiniform shape. Of the other dolphins, while Globocephalus and Grampus are most like Monodon, Orchella is most like the common porpoise, so too are Platanista and Pontoporia. The stomach of Balænoptera musculus, our example of a whalebone whale, is constructed upon the same plan as that of those dolphins that have been already considered. It has 4 chambers like that of the porpoise, but the proportions are a little different. This will be observed from the accompanying figure. It will be noted that the second chamber is larger than the first, and that the fourth is relatively small. A still greater reduction is seen, according to Sir William Turner, in the stomach of Balena mysticetus, at least in the fetus of that whale. The author just mentioned counted but 3 chambers in its stomach. The small intermediate chamber 3 appears to be absent. The stomach of the Ziphioid whales is in one important respect different from that of the whale group that we have hitherto considered. The stomachs of the genera Hyperoodon, Mesoplodon, and Ziphius have been carefully examined by more than one observer. Berardius alone is as yet unknown as regards its soft parts. As a general rule, the Ziphioid whales differ from others in the very large number of compartments into which the stomach is divided. 9, 10, even 13 or 14 divisions have been recorded, and the varied statements which occur in the literature of the subject with respect to the exact number of compartments in the stomach of a given species are not, it is thought, evidence of inaccuracy on the part of one or more of the describers, but simply an expression of actual variability. This, however, is a detailed difference. The most important difference is that the first division of the stomach gives off the second at its posterior and not at its anterior end. In the stomachs of the whales that we have been considering, a cuttlefish or a herring, when swallowed, might, so far as anatomical arrangement is concerned, pass at once into the second compartment as well as into the first, as will at once be seen in division number 2. That would be impossible in a Ziphioid. The first compartment of their stomachs is large, and from it lead, from the opposite extremity, be it remembered, to that where the esophagus enters, 6 to 13 smallish, round, orange-shaped cavities, of which the last, that immediately preceding the duodenum, is often the largest. It is so, for instance, in Mesoplodon bidens. What, then, is the exact correspondence between the stomachs of these whales and those of the dolphins and whalebone whales? The inevitable conclusion is that the first compartment of the latter whales is missing in the stomach of the Ziphioids. This conclusion is not only supported by a comparison of the actual structures concerned. As is so often the case, the solution of the problem is aided here by those occasional occurrences so useful to the morphologist of rudiments. In Hyperoodon, Dr. Jungklaus has detected a small representative of the first stomach of other whales in the form of a slight caecal dilatation of the esophagus just before it opens into the normal first stomach of that whale. This rudiment seems obviously to have the significance that he suggests, and moreover it showed internally a characteristic meandering arrangement of the folds of mucous membrane, an arrangement which is universal, or nearly so, in the first division of the stomach of dolphins. It appears, therefore, that the stomach of the Ziphioids is to be derived from that of dolphins and not vice versa. This is in harmony with other considerations, which point to the Ziphioids as modified, not archaic, forms of whales. See below. We may now compare the complicated whale stomach with the complicated ruminant's stomach. The latter, when typically developed, has the characters shown in the following description. The esophagus leads into a large paunch, the rumen. It equally leads into a smaller pouch, the reticulum. From this latter arises the psalterium, so called from the leaf-like arrangement of its folds of mucous membrane. Finally, there is the abomasum, the truly digestive part of the stomach. In having 4 compartments, the stomach of a typical ruminant agrees with that of the porpoise. But at this point the agreement stops. The first 3 divisions of the ruminant's stomach are clothed with esophageal epithelium. It is only the abomasum which is the truly digestive part of the stomach. Thus, in the ruminant, the stomach may be regarded as being primarily divided into 2 regions, the last of which only is the digestive portion. The first part is, again, sharply marked off into 3 regions. In the Cetacea, on the other hand, the stomach, although like that of the ruminant divided primarily into 2 parts, shows a further subdivision of the digestive part, which may be exceedingly complicated in the Ziphioids, while the non-digestive region is generally not divided at all, and if it is, i.e. monodon, etc., the division is not of so marked a character as in the ruminants. Even in the manatee the stomach is more ruminant than cetacean, for the true digestive stomach, apart from its 2 caeca, is not divided. Thus the stomach of ruminant and cetacean have only this in common, that the stomach is primarily divisible into 2 parts, but that is a universal character, and is indeed seen in other vertebrates, for example in birds, sharks, etc. From such a simply divided stomach as is seen in various rodents, and in other types of mammals, both the cetacean and the ruminant stomach may have arisen, and the resemblances between them will in this case be an example of that frequent phenomenon in the organic world, convergence. To account for this likeness by convergence is a matter of interesting inquiry. The other complicated stomachs which are found in mammals are invariably associated with a vegetarian diet. The sloth, the oxen and the sheep, and the manatee and dugong are all vegetable feeders. The whales are most distinctly carnivorous animals. It has been suggested, however, that whales ruminate like oxen. This process, in the Ruminantia, consists of the following series of acts. The animal bites off and swallows an immense amount of herbage, leaves, etc., and swallows them hastily. The mass thus swallowed is permeated by the saliva, and is then returned to the mouth, where it is thoroughly masticated at leisure, and re-swallowed to be properly digested. It is held that the Ruminantia, being as a rule timid creatures, who have to be on their guard against their numerous carnivorous foes, gain an advantage by this apparently complicated, and even disadvantageously complicated, act. They can lay in their store of food hastily and with rapidity, and then, at a more convenient season, when danger is not so pressing, remasticate and digest it at their leisure. Whales often feed among dense swarms of cuttlefish, crustaceans, etc., and it might seem that here, too, a kind of rumination might take place. The immense amount of food swallowed might be kept in the first division of the stomach and regurgitated for subsequent chewing. The fact that a large number of seals and porpoises, perfectly whole and intact, were found in the first division of the stomach of an orca seems to favor this hypothesis, as does also the statement of many that whales, when captured, generally allow some undigested, even unlacerated food to escape by the mouth. But on the contrary view, which is that usually accepted, we must consider the structure of the mouth, teeth, and tongue, all of which have an important bearing upon the existence or non-existence of prolonged mastication, such as characterizes ruminantia. The numerous and homodont teeth are not fitted for chewing. They are fitted simply for catching and retaining slippery fish and squid. The great length of the jaw in many forms does not permit of the essential lever action of the jaws in chewing. And finally, the immobile tongue is not of any use in aiding the performance of the function of mastication. A mobile tongue is obviously required to push back the food as it escapes from between the teeth. It is thus practically certain that whales do not ruminate. But in that case, of what use is the first stomach, devoid as it is of glands? In the ruminant it is a large storehouse. In whales this would seem to be needless. It is thought that the first stomach of the whale is a chamber in which the food is to some extent broken up and softened by mechanical means. It is analogous, in fact, on this view, to the bird's gizzard. The muscular layers of its walls are thicker than in the thin-walled rumen of the ruminant. Often, too, this compartment has been found to contain sand and stones, just as does the bird's gizzard, and for the matter of that, the stomach of the sea lion. This introduction of sand and stones may be accidental, but on the other hand its presence may be explained as an accessory to the trituration of the food. It is obvious that a trituration of this kind and rumination are mutually exclusive. The balance of probability is in favor of the former action of the first stomach. But even now we have not accounted for the complication of the true digestive stomach. It is to be noticed, however, that here, as already stated, we are free from any analogy with the herbivorous stomach. In the Sirenia and ruminants, this part of the stomach is not complicated. It is only the first part associated with the non-digestive functions of the stomach. This problem, it is to be feared, we must leave unsolved. Finally, there is the fact of the absence of the first stomach in the Ziphioids to explain physiologically. Dr. Jungklaus thinks that this is associated with their exclusive diet of cuttlefishes, which require no stomachal mastication. Their tissues are soft and are easily digested by the digestive part of the stomach, without any previous maceration and pressing. End of section 6. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Section 7 of The Book of Whales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. The Book of Whales by Frank Evers Beddard. Chapter 2. Some Internal Structures. Part 3. Teeth. Whales are, as is well known, divisible into two groups, those with and those without teeth, the Odontoceti and the Mysticoceti of various authors. The Mysticoceti, however, the whalebone whales, possess teeth in the young condition, while there are plenty of instances of the commencing disappearance of teeth among the Odontoceti. Thus, the line which separates the two divisions of existing whales is not so hard and fast as was stated before recent discoveries in the growth of the teeth of these animals. Before considering the growth of the teeth, however, it will be well to lay briefly before the reader the principal facts in the structure of the teeth of existing toothed whales. A very marked feature of their teeth is the characteristic homodonty. This term, it should be explained, is applied to teeth when the whole series is composed of teeth which are alike. In most mammals, there is what is known as heterodonty, i.e., the teeth are specialized in different directions. Thus, in man, there are the anterior incisors, cutting teeth, which are different in form and in function from the posterior cheek teeth, molars, or crushing teeth. The differentiation is more emphasized still in some other animals, less so again in others, but on the whole the mammals stand apart from all other vertebrate animals by the fact of their heterodonty. The teeth of a frog, of a snake, or of a lizard are all more or less alike. There is no possibility of speaking of incisors, canines, and molars. Another characteristic feature of mammalian dentition will be postponed until the actual dentition of adult whales has been described and compared with that of other mammals. Broadly speaking, it is correct to define the toothed whales as mammals in which there is no specialization of the teeth, but there are some slight exceptions which will be dealt with presently. The number, size, and position of the teeth of the Odontocetes varies, but the majority have a large number of smallish, conical teeth embedded in both upper and lower jaws. The actual numbers vary much. The greatest number are seen in the genus Inia, where no less than 221 are reckoned up. As will be seen in the account of the different kinds of whales, the number of the teeth is often made use of as a generic character. Among the Delphinidae there are a gradual series of genera in which the number of teeth gets reduced. It must not be imagined, however, that we can actually start from some such form as Inia with abundant teeth, and derive from it the various genera in which the teeth are reduced, and arrange those genera in order of this reduction, but it will be convenient to take them in such an order. Through a gradual reduction in the number we arrive at the genus Delphinapterus, the beluga, where there are but 9 teeth on each side of the jaw. In Grampus this dentition is still further reduced. The teeth in the upper jaw have disappeared altogether, and there are only a few, 3 to 7, on each side of the lower jaw, arranged near to the symphysis of the mandibles. Another line culminates in the narwhal Monodon, where all the teeth have vanished in the adult animal save the well-known tusk, and the accompanying tusk of smaller size, sometimes equally developed, in the upper jaw. In this case it is the lower jaw which has become edentulous. A second series of modifications is seen among the Physeteridae, the cachalot, and the Ziphioid whales. The cachalot has functional teeth only in the mandible, where they form a row of strong conical teeth, but in addition to these are a series of smaller teeth in the upper jaw, which are not to be seen in the dried skull, as they are not embedded in the bone but only in the gum, which naturally is stripped off or decays away in the course of preparation of the skull for museum purposes. This kind of reduction is still further exaggerated in the Ziphioid whales. In all of these, the number of teeth actually used is very limited, not more than 2 pairs, usually 1 pair, and those are limited to the lower jaw. But in addition to these, there are in most, if not in all, Ziphioid whales a set of smaller teeth only in the upper jaw or in both jaws, which are, like the corresponding teeth of the cachalot, embedded only in the gum, and so are, as a rule, lost in skulls acquired by museums. These teeth are clearly on the wane, and as even the teeth of the lower jaw are sometimes not extruded, and in other cases lost before the animal dies, it is evident that these whales are not so very far removed from the whalebone whales, but it should be observed that they exhibit no trace of the compensating whalebone. So much then for the general modifications of the teeth as regards numbers, which are exhibited in the series of toothed whales. The question arises, are those whales with the most teeth the most primitive, and have they given rise to those with a reduced dentition? Or is the converse true? Or finally, is it safest to take the middle path and make 2 series, one ascending and one descending? Are, for instance, dolphins with a moderate number of teeth nearest to the ancestral form from which have arisen by multiplication on the one hand the Inia, and by reduction the narwhal? This supposition agrees in some ways more nearly with what we know of mammalian dentition in general. It has been pointed out that the typical mammalian dentition is heterodont. It is also limited in numbers, and those numbers are definite. Apart from the marsupials, in which moreover 56 is the greatest number of teeth, and a very few other instances, no mammal has or had more than 44 teeth. Even here there is nothing like the abundance of teeth of Inia or Platanista. Furthermore, the number of teeth of the many-toothed dolphins appears to be not exactly fixed to a tooth or 2, whereas in the Mammalia, as a rule with but few exceptions, such as Priodon and Armadillo and the manatee, the number does not vary except, of course, on occasional abnormalities. On a priori grounds, therefore, dangerous grounds sometimes on which to build an argument intended to last, we should be rather disposed to regard the excessive dentition of the typical dolphins as not a primitive state of affairs, but one derived from something more nearly approaching to what is characteristic of mammals in general. In a number of skulls belonging to various genera of Delphinidae with numerous teeth, Professor Kukenthal found here and there that the regular arrangement of the relative positions of teeth in the upper and lower jaw was lost. The regular arrangement is that the teeth of the 2 jaws should alternate, An obvious convenient arrangement for the due prehension of the fish or octopuses upon which they feed. Alternating teeth would be better able to lay hold of this slippery food. When this accurate correspondence ceases, it is brought about by the intercalation of teeth, a proceeding which naturally increases the total number. If this process is going on now, there is nothing unreasonable in thinking that it has been going on in the past in correspondence, perhaps, with the increase in length of the jaws themselves. Thus the number of teeth in dolphins is greater now than it has been. They are, therefore, to be derived from creatures with fewer teeth, so far more like the typical Mammalia. Another argument pointing in the same direction is afforded by the ancient Zeuglodonts, treated of more fully on another page. These cetaceans had a dentition conforming in number of teeth to the more typical Mammalia. Their teeth were also more conformable to those of the Mammalia generally in their heterodonty, but we shall recur to this after considering the traces of heterodonty still remaining in the group of whales. Having dealt generally with the number of teeth among existing Cetacea, their shapes remain for consideration. As a rule, the teeth of whales are simple and conical in form, directed either upwards or rather forwards. They resemble in fact the canine teeth of other mammals, not only in this shape, but in their being implanted by a single root. There are, however, a few examples of some, though not a great deal of, specialization in the form of the teeth. In Inia geoffrensis, the posterior series of teeth have a distinct lateral cusp, so that they have ceased to be simply peg-like teeth. In the common porpoise, Phocana communis, the teeth have broad divided crowns which are sharply marked off from the root. There is reminiscence here of the more complicated teeth of ancestral forms such as the Zeuglodonts. The extraordinary strap-shaped teeth of Mesoplodon layardi and the tusks of the narwhal need not be referred to in the present connection. They appear to be simply exaggerations, perhaps originally pathological, of the simple conditions obtaining in other whales. They are probably not to be looked upon as an inheritance from terrestrial ancestors. Professor Kukenthal has a theory that the simple teeth of whales are to be derived from the splitting up of more complicated teeth, such as are found in other mammals. In Zeuglodonts, called so on this very account, each tooth is formed of two pieces, each with its separate root. By division of these, the more numerous teeth of a dolphin can be arrived at. But recent investigations into the manatee seem to negative this theory, for in that animal an indefinite succession of complicated teeth occurs. In almost all Mammalia, the individual is provided with two sets of teeth. There is the dentition found in the young. This is later replaced by the dentition of the adult. The two sets of teeth are spoken of respectively as the milk and the permanent dentition. This is characteristic of the Mammalia, and distinguishes them from lower vertebrates where there is not this merely double dentition. New teeth in the lower vertebrates are formed as they are wanted. If a mammal loses one of the teeth of the second series, that tooth is not replaced. The relative importance of these two sets of teeth varies much. The milk teeth are sometimes only developed as rudiments, never of functional use, while in other cases the milk teeth persist for a long time and are very distinctly functional. It has been even attempted to be shown that in the marsupials it is the permanent dentition which is suppressed, and only represented by rudiments, while the teeth of the full-grown animal are the persistent milk teeth. This general character of the Mammalia has been described as diphyodont, and it was thought that by this the majority of mammals were to be distinguished from some that had but one set of teeth, and were accordingly to be termed monophyodont. In some of the Edentata, the sloth, it is still believed that only one set of teeth is ever produced, and the same view was originally held about the toothed whales. There is, however, now not the least doubt that the dolphins are truly diphyodont mammals, thus conforming in a very important character to the terrestrial allies. But it is not quite settled which of the two dentitions it is that persists. It is held by Kukenthal that the dental series of whales belongs to the milk dentition. Thus the whales are clearly descendants of purely diphyodont mammals. We have now to consider the whalebone whales, which in the adult condition have no teeth, only the plates of baleen, which will be treated of on another page. As long ago as the year 1807, Geoffroy St. Hilaire discovered the rudiments of teeth in a fetus of the Greenland whale, Balena mysticetus. and this important discovery was afterwards confirmed by the great Cuvier, as well as by his less known brother Frederick Cuvier. Since then, the facts have been confirmed by others. The first discoverers of the facts contented themselves with little more than a statement of them. But later Professor Julin laid great stress upon the additional fact that the teeth of Balænoptera rostrata, which he examined, were not merely simple conical teeth, but of a more complicated pattern. He found teeth with one cusp, like those of Cetacea generally, and two, and even with three cusps. The simple teeth, moreover, were those in the anterior part of the jaws, the more complicated teeth further back. In fact, there is an obvious likeness to a set of incisors followed by the more complicated cheek teeth. This arrangement is typical of mammals, and is found in the cetacean Zeuglodon. An addition of great weight has been made to these discoveries by Professor Kukenthal, who found besides the fairly well-developed rudiments of teeth very rudimentary traces of a second dentition, thus showing that the whalebone whales, like their toothed allies, are diphyodont like other mammals. Furthermore, he has given reasons for believing that in them, as in the toothed whales, it is the milk dentition which persisted longest, as it is represented by the most fully developed rudiments. The brain. The brain of all whales presents a most unusual shape of that organ. It is very much compressed from before backwards, and is thus broader than it is long. It looks almost as if these creatures, rushing through the waves, had flattened their brains in the effort to oppose the weight of water. But though so much shortened and comparatively small in total bulk, the cerebral hemispheres of the cetacea make up to some extent by the highly developed convolutions of the brain surface. It used to be held, and the belief is often seen in popular books, i.e., books which deal loosely with the facts and inferences of science, that the furrows of a brain corresponded with its thoughtfulness, that the higher the type the more abundant these grooves and furrows upon the surface, which separate the complicated system of ridges of brain substance known as the convolutions. It is, of course, perfectly true that the brain of the highest animal of all, man, is markedly and abundantly convoluted. It cannot be said, however, that the titanic whale is largely superior in intelligence to the small and active marmoset, and yet, if the convolutions of the brain were to be alone considered, this would have to be the opinion. For the marmoset's brain is not far from being quite smooth, while we have already commented upon the markedly convoluted character of that of the whale. The real relationship appears to be between size of body and complication of the brain's surface, and this is more obvious when nearly related animals are compared with each other. The marmoset, for instance, has a smoother brain than the gorilla. The rhinoceros and the hippopotamus have much more furrowed brains than the smaller ungulates. Our whales are, curiously enough, an exception to this generalization. It cannot be said that the great rorqual or sperm whale has a brain which is at all definitely superior in the number of its convolutions to the brains of smaller whales. Can we in any way account for the curious shape and the great convolution of the brain surface in cetacea? In the first place, it is as well to be convinced that they do want accounting for. This can hardly be doubted. The singular shape of the hemispheres of the whale are so peculiar that they suffice to define the group. There is nothing like it elsewhere among mammals. Then again, there are some reasons for considering the whales to occupy a low position in the mammalian series, reasons which will be dealt with on another page. We should expect therefore to find a lowish type of brain. Instead of this, we are confronted with the most specialized. Nothing is more difficult in zoology than to arrive at convenient generalizations, for the paradoxical reason that it is so easy to frame hypotheses. The expression simplex sigillum veri, not composed for the purpose for which it is used, and yet used with such frequency in zoological writing, especially in the newer developments of what is called sometimes Darwinism, has had a most deleterious effect upon speculation. A simple and obvious explanation often seems to such writers to settle the question at issue. And yet, in the long run, it seems to be plain that the processes of nature are not so simple. It is certain that the brains of some of the early and extinct forms of mammals were not only small but smooth. It is equally certain that their descendants, or at least allied forms subsequent in date, have not only larger but more rumpled brains. The whales, we can fairly assume, are an ancient stock, and may have started even as whales with small and smooth brains. The requisite increase was brought about by a more extensive crumpling of the surface, while the small frontal bones and the large development of the facial region of the skull prevented the extension of the brain cavity forwards, its extension laterally being permitted partly by the non-union of the parietals above, and by the feebly attached bony apparatus connected with the organ of hearing. It seems to follow further that the whales cannot be nearly related to any existing form of mammal, as the brain development has pursued so different a path. Sir William Turner has pointed out that a large number of the smaller convolutions of the whale's brain are transverse to the long axis of that organ, which suggests that there has been, as it were, a tendency to grow forward in the ordinary mammalian fashion, but a check to the same growth, which has naturally resulted in furrows having the direction referred to. In any case, the whale's brain is partly characterized by the features to which attention has been called. It is also remarkable for the fact that in the toothed whales there is absolutely no vestige of these four parts of the brain which are connected with the sense of smell, while in the whalebone whales the same region is only feebly visible. It is sometimes erroneously asserted that creatures living in the water cannot smell, owing to the suspension in the water of the odoriferous particles. But this is at once negatived by the case of fishes, which have a well-developed olfactory apparatus. Anyhow, whales have not, but it is apparently not to be put down to their marine habitat, one of the very few structures indeed which cannot be correlated with that mode of life. Whalebone. The real nature of whalebone was frequently, like that of spermaceti, misunderstood in past times. Bilan, translated by Scammon, wrote upon the matter as follows: "And that which is called whalebone, coste de baleine, literally whale's ribs, with which ladies nowadays make their corsets and stiffen out their dresses, and which the beadles of some churches carry as wands, these are certain pieces cut off and drawn out from that which serves as eyelids for the whale, and which covers his eyes, and which is furnished at its extremity with a kind of long stiff hair. This is what the Latins call the pretentures, and which they say enables the animal to direct his course through the sea." This latter notion, as Sir William Flower points out, is probably connected with the old feudal law cited by Blackstone, that the tails of all whales belonged to the Queen, as a perquisite to furnish Her Majesty's wardrobe with whalebone. Scaliger, too, in his commentaries upon Aristotle, observes of whalebone, "In superciliis lamellis habet quae cum caput mergit attolantur ab aqua, atque ida vidende potestas sit, ubi vero ex aqua exerit, concident lamellae, atque tigant oculos." Probably this and the former view is due in part to the tiny eye which escaped attention, and indeed seems, on account of the peculiar development of the skull, to have an abnormal situation. Nevertheless, at the same period in which Belon wrote, the accurate location of whalebone was understood, for Olaus Magnus described in a stranded rorqual the whalebone, of which he remarked, "Palato adherabant quasi laminae corneae," and proceeded to point out that these laminae were not all of the same size, a fact which is well known to be the case with the laminae of whalebone. Later still, whalebone was quite properly described by T. Johnson in 1634 as "the fins that stand forth of their mouths, which are commonly called whalebones, being dried and polished, serve to make busks for women." Shakespeare, however, seems to have confused the true meaning of the term. He writes of "teeth as white as whalebone," but it is believed that by whalebone in this case is meant the tusks of the walrus, an animal which was often and at many times confounded with whales. Indeed, it is not always easy to decide whether a given illustration refers to this animal or to some large toothed whale such as Orca. There is, however, curiously enough, some justification for accepting Shakespeare's epithet of white in a perfectly literal fashion, for in many whales the whalebone is white, or whitish in parts or altogether. The more celebrated Dr. Johnson, in the Dictionary edition of 1818, defines whalebone as "the fin of a whale cut and used in making stays," thus reverting to earlier errors. It is, however, just possible that the stiff, tendinous tissue of the actual tail was made use of as a material for stiffening articles of wear. It is quite conceivable that when dried it might form a cheaper substitute for real whalebone. The number of times that the expression fin is employed, and the evident knowledge possessed by at any rate some persons who correctly located the true whalebone may perhaps point this way. Whalebone has, it need hardly perhaps be remarked, nothing to do with true teeth, but it is distinctly analogous to the horny so-called teeth of the Ornithorhynchus, and it is an interesting fact that the whales show the same tendency observable in other groups of the animal kingdom to the replacement of teeth by horny structures. The horny teeth of the platypus have their forerunners in the shape of true teeth, which are shed early. In birds, the most archaic forms had true teeth, but the birds of today have developed in their place the horny beak which characterizes them. The whalebone whales start life with rudimentary teeth which ultimately disappear on the appearance of the whalebone. The general character of whalebone resembles that of horns or hair. The color is black or white or brown. The place where the whalebone is formed is the roof of the mouth, the palate. The plates of whalebone are triangular in shape, the base of attachment being broader than the lower free extremity. The plates are attached by the broad base to the roof of the mouth, and they may indeed be regarded as an exaggeration of the ridges, often horny in character, which are found upon the roof of the mouth of all mammals. The plates are arranged in a direction transverse to the long axis of the mouth, and are very numerous, as many as 370 having been counted. The blades are longest in the middle of this long series, and gradually diminish towards both ends of the mouth. The outside of the blades, that turned towards the lips, is straight and hard. The inner surface is frayed out into innumerable hair-like processes. Thus an exceedingly efficient straining apparatus is formed. The fine hairs entangle the minute creatures upon which the Greenland whale feeds, and at the same time allows the water to escape through the sides of the mouth between the lips. A more detailed description of the mechanism of the whalebone in the Greenland whale will be found under the account of that whale. It has been suggested that certain transverse lines upon the plate of baleen are annual rings. In this event, the Greenland whale lives to an age of 900 years. The use of whalebone for ladies' stays and formerly for the ribs of umbrellas is well known, but it may be one of those things not so generally known that certain rich silks which stand of themselves owe some of their firmness to very thin shreds of whalebone incorporated with the silk threads. Another little-known use of whalebone was its employment in the 13th century as plumes for helmets. This use is proved by two passages from William the Breton, where the Count of Boulogne is described as wearing upon his helmet the Branchia baleni britici ponti. This reference has been collected by M. Fisher in his careful account of the Biscayan whale, to which further reference will be made below when that species comes to be treated of. Whalebone is still a costly article. Mr. Southwell, in an article for The Zoologist for 1897, upon the whale fishery of the previous year, observes that the value of the bone was £2,000 per ton. As 12 right whales produce 135 1/4 hundredweights of whalebone, the results of a successful whaling cruise are considerable. End of section 7. Recording by Colleen McMahon.